Welcome back. I trust you were blessed and inspired by this presentation, the first presentation of Dr. Tennent. In case you were not able to join us at the beginning of this mission conference, the speaker is Dr. Tennent, president of Asbury Theological Seminary, theologian and missiologist. The second topic that he's going to be presenting now is Christianity and the challenge of Buddhism, ethics in Christianity and Buddhism. Welcome, Dr. Tennent.
Thank you so much. It's good once again to be back and to share with you the second lecture, which focuses on Buddhism. Buddhism, as we move further to the east in our 1040 window, you'll notice that Buddhism is predominant religion, as you know, from throughout Southeast Asia, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and major influence throughout China and Japan, particularly a group like Pure Land Buddhist. Buddhism traces its historical origin to a descent movement within Hinduism. It's an anti-Brahminical descent movement. The Hindus have four major caste groupings. The top is the Brahmins, and this second group is a Kshatriya. This is a Kshatriya movement against Hinduism. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in the 6th century BC. Siddhartha Gautama was born into a life of wealth and privilege as a child in a region that's really connected today to modern-day Nepal and northeast India. After being shielded from pain and suffering for many years in the opulence of his surroundings, he went on a very famous chariot ride in Buddhist history, and he encountered the realities of old age, of sickness, and even of death. This created a dramatic experience for Siddhartha Gautama that he eventually comes back and he forsakes all of his pleasures, all of his wealth, and he goes out at 29 years old and seeking out the path to enlightenment. This is called, in Buddhism, it's called the first great renunciation. Well, he spends the next 6 years studying under various Hindu leaders, Hindu Brahmins and other leaders, Kshatriyas as well, learning techniques of meditation and other kinds of techniques. After 6 years of that work, he eventually abandons that and says the Hindus do not have the way to enlightenment, and he meditates under a Bodhi tree, which is a very famous tree in that part of the world. And beneath that tree, he had this period of enlightenment. And from this point on, his name is changed from Siddhartha Gautama to the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. And he spends the next 45 years as the Buddha, traveling around the subcontinent, spreading his teaching and founding monasteries. Now, it's so difficult, especially today, looking at the breadth of Buddhism from Theravada to Mahayana to Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism. It's an extremely diverse religion. But there is a core teaching to Buddhism that I wanted to start with briefly before we get into the main topic of today. And these core teachings are actually a series of things which are laid out in the Buddha's first two sermons. This is at least how it's organized in literature. And the first sermon the Buddha gave is what is today known as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths basically argue, first of all, that all of life is suffering. This is the word dukkha. This affirms this endless cycle of birth and rebirth, death and rebirth. It is essentially exactly the same as the wheel of samsara in Hinduism, is this chain of causality in Buddhism. The difference is that the Buddhists saw it with much more detail. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. Secondly, the second Four Noble Truths is that the cause of this suffering is caused by desire, by tanha. And so the idea is that all of your misery, all of your suffering is caused because of desires inside of you. Which brings to the third noble truth, which is that if you can extinguish that desire, then you can extinguish that desire and therefore the suffering. And then finally, the fourth noble truth, that there is an eightfold path which leads to the extinguishing of desire and therefore liberation or moksha, nirvana. Well, this, of course, is basically the Buddhist monastic way, where you travel through these 8 fetters, which leads you through many lifetimes in monastic life to be liberated from the wheel of samsara. And we'll come back later to how this gets challenged by Buddhist thinking, but that basic belief in the first sermon is held by all Buddhists. The Four Noble Truths are undergirded by 2 other doctrines which come up in the second sermon, which are very, very important. The whole of Buddhist religion is undergirded by a doctrine which is translated different ways, but it's generally called like dependent arising or conditioned genesis. The word is in the Pali, it's patitya samuppada. It means that everything has a earlier cause. There is no first cause. All of life is pictured as a circular chain. Again, this is the wheel of samsara, but it's now viewed more specifically as 12 causal links. I'm going to try to see if I can show you the picture of this right here on the screen so you can see it for yourself. Now, what you'll notice on the screen are the 12, what's called the causal links. Now, Hinduism had a wheel of samsara, but they did not have all this detail listed in. So each of these 1 to 12 represent the 12 causal links in Buddhism. Now, what you'll notice on the inside of the circle, I have different kinds of words. There's 5 words there. You'll see on the top left the word body, and then on the right, consciousness. In the bottom left, mental attitudes, and then you'll see the very, very bottom, perceptions, and then feelings, sensations. Now, what those are the what's called the 5 aggregates. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But the 5 aggregates is what they believe constitutes what you believe to be you. Now, you'll notice that I have these connected to various parts of the 12 causal links with a color. So you see the body there is connected to 3 of them. It's link 4, 11, and 12, which is yellow in my chart. Mental attitudes is connected to 9 and 10, the red in my chart. Perceptions is connected to number 7, which is the brown in my chart. The feelings and sensations connected to the dark green, number 5 and 6, contact, 5 senses and mind. And then consciousness is connected to links 2 and 3. And what Buddha realized in this vision was that 5 aggregates are connected to 10 of these 12 links. You'll notice there's 2 of the links. In this case, it's the blue links on this chart, just to help you see it visually. There's no color in the Buddhist kind of worldview on this, but this is just to help you see it and distinguish the links. The link 1 and 8, or you might say the weak links in the chain, right? This is the problems. This is the ones with the least karmic incrustations on them. So the Buddhist preaching is to dispel ignorance, and the Four Noble Truths says you must create and break desire. See, tanha or desire, link 8, that's the problem. If you can break that, the whole chain falls away. And because you're so encrusted by the other 10 links, you can't break those links. It's impossible. So basically, Buddhism is focused on link number 8, and that's why the Third Noble Truth is that you have to break this desire, and then you can be free from your suffering. So this is called the 12 causal links. Very, very important in Buddhism, and it goes like this. Basically, says when this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. It basically means that this wheel is turning, we're on the wheel, it has no beginning or end, and it continues on, and there's no first cause. So just put it bluntly, in light of last lecture, it means you cannot say, in the beginning, God, much less God created. There is no first cause in Buddhism. Now, this is connected to the second part of this second sermon, is the doctrine of anatta. Now, I mentioned earlier that Buddhism is a dissent movement against Hinduism. So what happens is Buddhism if you really want to get into the Hindu worldview, Buddhism is the best way to understand what they believe to be the real underbelly of Hinduism that they knew Hinduism could not absorb them. Because in the like in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, we talk about things are right and wrong, that's wrong, this is right, whatever. So we're often saying, no, we disagree with that. But in the Hindu world, they will say, yeah, we agree with everything. Hinduism beats you not by telling you you're wrong, but by telling you you're right and absorbing you into their worldview. So the Hinduism is the great absorber of other religions. So Buddhism could not survive without finding a way to posit a doctrines that the Hindus could not absorb. And there are two doctrines that Hindus believe, that is Brahman and Atman, that there's an ultimate reality called Brahman, that yourself is reduced to a single element that's known as Atman. And the whole Upanishads is the realization that Atman is Brahman. So Buddhism, in order to push back against being absorbed into Hinduism, which can absorb everything, Buddhism says we don't believe in Brahman, that is to say there's no first cause, and we don't believe in Atman. Now if you deny the self, you have a big challenge, because you have to say, well, how do you explain our existence? We're people, we walk around, we seem to have existence. How can you say there is no self? And their answer is the five aggregates. These aggregates, bodily form, the feeling, perceptions, mind, consciousness, all of that creates through karma a perception of your selfness, when in fact, or suchness as they call it, in fact, you do not have that. It is not there. It's like an onion. You peel layers back and there's no core in the middle. So that's kind of the original basic form of Buddhism. Later on, they had their own reaction within Buddhism called the Mahayana movement. And Mahayana means the great vehicle. This is the lay Buddhism, and therefore Buddhism has now 80% of Buddhism are these people that belong to the great vehicle. Now, in this particular group, they are also struggling with, how do we talk about reality? Is there a way of discussing reality? If we don't believe in a first cause, how can there be any ultimate reality? And if there's not, it will not lead to nihilism. So essentially, put it bluntly, quickly, Buddhism eventually develops two separate schools of thought. One is the Madhyamaka, which believes that there is actually nothing. All we are, if you go into nirvana, you go into nothingness or emptiness. And when the chain is broken, it goes into nothingness. Buddha was once asked directly, what is nirvana? And Buddha's response was, nirvana is like a person who has an oil lamp and they quit putting oil in the lamp. And oil represents desire. The lamp is you, what you think of as you. And so the lamp is burning, or the flame is you. So here's the oil burning, but you quit putting oil in it. And so it gets, eventually the oil runs out and the wick starts drying up and the light starts getting dimmer and dimmer because it runs out of oil. And at some point, Buddha says, the light will go out. There's a little whiff of smoke. That whiff of smoke, before it dissipates into nothing, that's nirvana. Now that is a story to illustrate the Madhyamaka view that in fact the reality is nothingness. Of course, there's many cartoons about this. One of my famous cartoons is the Dalai Lama, who at one point is at a Christmas party and someone gives him a present. And he opens the box up, and of course the box is empty, and he says in the cartoon, nothing, it's what I've always wanted. It's one of the classic Buddhist jokes. You can feel free to retell that. But the point is, that's the Madhyamaka view, actually. It's one school of Buddhism. The other is Yogacara. Yogacara is, in Western philosophy, a form of solipsism, which is believe that the reality is in the mind. Now, they believe that all this reality rests in the human mind. So they also reject any ultimate reality, and the way we would view it as any objective sovereign God in the universe is simply a matter of mental perceptions. So the Yogacara argue that we talk about God like a person who shouts, at the rim of a canyon, and all we're hearing back is an echo. We think that echo is God, but actually it comes from ourselves. We are the projection of all of these things that we call reality. The Madhyamika say the whole of reality is more like a mirror where you image things. Like a mirror has no actual image. In fact, there's nothing there. Another thing that often shocks my students when people study Zen Buddhism is one of the famous Zen statements. It goes like this. They have what's called koans, or statements that are made to help you understand a deeper truth. And one of them is this: if you meet the Buddha on the road, you should kill him. Now, that is a shocking thing, because you think this is the founder of their religion. This is like their revered one. This is the enlightened one, the Buddha. And yet, the saying is, if you meet him on the road, you should kill him. And we would say, if you meet Christ on the road, like the two roads of Emmaus, you should worship him. But what this is talking about is saying that from the point of view of the Buddhist, the historicity of the Buddha is not that important. What matters is the teaching that he left behind, because they don't believe in the reality of the self. So they have one of their other sayings is, the Eightfold Path exists, but no traveler on it. Suffering exists, but none suffering. It really says it all, actually. So at this point, we want to move to the second part of this lecture, which focuses on ethics and Buddhism. This brings us to our main kind of application, because in the world of interreligious dialogue, I've spent decades in this world dialoguing with many other religious groups. It's often said in these groups that Buddhist ethics is really the high point of Buddhism. This is the one place where we can finally find common ground, because the whole Buddhism is built on a form of ethics, because what it teaches, and we haven't had time to go into these details, but is that there are certain people that go through all of this Eightfold Path, the monastic path, in the Theravada Buddhism, and they get to the very end of the path. They've gone through hundreds of lifetimes to get there, and they're now ready to go into nirvana, go into nothingness. And right before they step off the wheel of samsara, they have this moment of compassion when they decide to step back on the wheel of samsara and to stay back in this life and to teach other people and to spread the news of enlightenment. This is what they believe the Buddha did. So the whole point is they are viewed as a compassion religion, trying to help other people achieve enlightenment, and it becomes very, very important. Well, I see serious flaws as a Christian communicator in the Buddhist view of ethics. First is this: true ethics is really impossible when you deny the nature of the self. Think about it. In the Christian worldview, the whole of Christian ethics is built around the idea that a person who shows an act of mercy or kindness or compassion, and someone who receives those ethical acts, this is a real exchange between real people. We believe that this is actually based on the incarnation. Jesus comes down in history as a real person, and he walks through the world as an act of compassion in the world. So therefore, we believe that all of our acts of compassion, whether you're doing a soup kitchen or whether you are rescuing someone from human trafficking or anything like that, we believe that as a Christian worldview, you are reenacting the incarnation, obviously in a very small seed form way, but you are reflecting, it's been a word, you're reflecting the incarnation in seed form in any act that you do that is basically spanning the redeemed community to those who need the gospel, just as God came down in Jesus Christ to save us. In Buddhism, however, despite all the lofty language, there actually is neither, there's no I who acts and there's no thou who receives the action, except an illusory cause and chain within the chain of ignorance, the 12 causal links we discussed earlier. So ethics happens on a provisional level, a temporary level, until the full realization is received. By the way, this is something that their texts teach explicitly. For example, there's a story about a man who comes home and he has children upstairs, 4 or 5 children upstairs playing in the upstairs. This is found, by the way, in the Lotus Sutra, a very famous Buddhist text. And in the Lotus Sutra, he sees the house burning, and he realizes his children are upstairs playing, and they have no idea the catastrophe that's upon them. Well, the father thinks quickly and realizes the only way to get their children down, he has no time to explain to them what's happening. The first floor is already in flames. So he tells them, if you come down quickly, if you jump out of the window in my arms quickly, I will give you, and he names them their most favorite toy. What he knows, every child is given a different toy promise. And the children jump out into his arms and they're all rescued from the fire. Now, the point of that is that what he called out, he wasn't going to give them a toy. There was no toy involved. It was just what had to happen in order to get the children to respond. Now, in the Buddhist religious structure, this is called the doctrine of expedient means. It means that Buddha will basically teach you whatever he needs to teach you in order for you to get down the road to enlightenment. It doesn't mean that any of the things that he teaches you are applicable or helpful for someone else. He's like a doctor prescribing your illness, not necessarily the person next to you's illness. Therefore, they say that all of ethics is like a raft. You're going across a river. When you get across the river, you throw the raft away. This is, again, their own teaching. So it actually downplays the importance of the self. Now, as Christians, we understand that this clearly demotes ethics to a functional level. In other words, ethical actions in their world do not actually exist. They're just temporarily useful for the sake of one's enlightenment. The goal of suffering and the goal of ethics in Buddhism is not really about eliminating suffering, since there's no one who is suffering. The goal of Buddhist ethics is not to assist humanity, but to transcend humanity. And this inevitably mires Buddhism in a negative assessment of the human race. So ethics are not directed toward a real person with innate dignity or worth. Instead, it says there's no one who can be valued or attributed dignity. There's no self that's actually there. Therefore, from the smallest act of a child, doing something, some kindness to a child or by a child, to the vicarious suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary, and everything in between must all be declared ultimately illusory, having no ultimate substance or reality. Because they say, again, one of their analogies, all of life is really but a dream. When you awaken, as say, go to nirvana, you realize that this is all insubstantial, nothing more than the aggregate of the five aggregates that are clinging to each other or grasping to each other in this causal nexus that gives us the appearance of self and relationships, etc. Now, if you went to sleep one night, and during the night you dreamed that you were performing charitable deeds. In your dream, you were feeding the hungry or tending the sick or building homes for the homeless, or as the Adventists have done all over the world, building amazing medical centers to help people in need. If you dream that, you might wake up in the morning and be inspired to do that, but you never could say that you had done that. This is a really important distinction in the Buddhist worldview. But yet, for Buddhism, the whole of life is nothing more than an insubstantial dream of aggregate causes and effects which arise and cease, arise and cease. The Christian doctrine of ethics is rooted in God, who created and fashioned us in his image. And when he comes, he doesn't come to transcend or extinguish humanity, but to ignite it into even a more fully alive than ever before. That's the gospel. So Buddhist compassion can never really rise above pity, because the focus is never on real human sufferers, but only on the causal chain of conditions which gives rise to the illusory experience of suffering, which we're trapped in the wheel of samsara. In contrast, Christianity is about real people bound in a common dignity as people created in the image of God. Everyone is created in the image of God, and therefore it's a basis for Christian compassion for those that are in need. The Bible says we love because he first loved us. It's because of his prior action we respond and reflect that ethical action in the world. God's nature and God's own love, who created us in his image, bestowed that dignity on his own creation. In First John's epistle, if someone says, I love God, but hates his brother, he's a liar. Anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And he's given us this command: whoever loves God must love his neighbor. So Christian ethics is clearly linked to the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. The Bodhisattva, which is their what they call the enlightened being, that person I mentioned earlier that was on the wheel of samsara, about to step off and go into nirvana, but comes back to help alleviate suffering. This person is called a Bodhisattva. Bodhi means enlightened. Sat means being. So a Bodhisattva means one who is an enlightened being. Well, this enlightened being is often in Buddhist dialogue compared to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is an enlightened being in the world, and so is the Bodhisattva. But again, the compassionate Bodhisattva, and granted, it's completely surrounded by language of compassion, but it is also part of the causal nexus with no substantial reality. The Buddhist Bodhisattva descends, but it descends within the chain of rebirth, whereas Jesus is from outside of the created order. He steps into our creation and into the page of human history. It's very different than Bodhisattva. Secondly, Bodhisattva believes that the reason they choose to come back, as it turns out, is they believe that even they will not ultimately be saved or moksha until all sentient beings are delivered. In other words, I can't be saved till you're saved. Well, that's great, and I understand what they teach there, but the point is that can't be compared to Jesus Christ, who did not need to be saved. As an act of sacrifice, he came and gave his life for us, and he had no share in the fallenness of the human race. The second major flaw in Buddhism, the first is they don't have the belief in a self. That changes ethics completely. The second is that they also deny the conception of good and evil, and that is crucial for a proper description of Christian ethics. Buddhism rejects all dualistic conceptions as illusory. So they believe they're only present in the world in a provisional way. So, for example, dichotomies like saved and lost, heaven or hell, God, Satan, good, evil, all of these are categories which the Buddhists believe are ultimately must be viewed as one. Buddhism shares the monistic worldview of the Hindus on this point. So what they are saying is that you must transcend these dichotomies. One of the great insights of Buddhism is when they finally declare that samsara is nirvana. In other words, you can't distinguish between the two, or you miss the Buddhist vision. Now, that's really, really important because that cannot be ignored from a Christian point of view. How can loving kindness and charity and giving be recognized or measured when ultimately there's no distinction between good and evil? And once the Bodhisattva has achieved enlightenment or nirvana, how can anything be declared compassionate? See, it assumes in the Christian worldview that if you show compassion, there's some negative consequence if you withhold it. This is one of the big challenges of the whole karmic worldview, where we used to meet in India men who would go down to the Friday night of getting paid. They used to have 5 numbers inside their envelope or their check, or they would gamble it away on Friday night, lose an entire week's work through gambling. Come home, their children in destitute situations, in misery, living in squalor, and yet when you pressed them and said, don't you realize you are responsible for their suffering? They say, no, it's their karma. The whole point of karma, it cuts the link, the relational link, and it also cuts the link between categories like good and evil. So this is really crucial, because Paticca, this causal nexus, is the great leveler in Buddhism, and reduces everything to the obliteration of categories of good and evil. So in the Buddhist worldview, we're not simply helping to alleviate people in a particular suffering state, but everyone, whether you're in a, quote, happy state or not, must also be liberated, because all of life is suffering. That's the first noble truth. So in this lecture, we've sought to explore how we understand Christian ethics within the context of Buddhist ethics. What we've seen is if you deny the self and place ethics in the context where you have no relational bond or even the differentiation between good and evil, then one has a very, very difficult challenge. One of my concerns as a Christian witness, and I've had hundreds of dialogues with Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, especially Muslims in recent years. And I want to say, while I believe it's important to find common ground, because there are things we can do collectively to help in the larger society, which won't listen to us unless we work together across kind of we want the public square to be naked, but to be pluralistic, that we might have a voice. That kind of thing is there. But my deeper concern, it's also important to recognize, and you're doing dialogues, it's okay to realize that we have boundaries. There are things that make a Christian proclamation distinctive, and the Buddhists just don't believe it or accept it. In the same way, there are things that actual Buddhists actually believe that we do not accept. And that's not a problem. That is, I mean, obviously from a Christian point of view of preaching and teaching, it's a challenge, it's a big challenge. What I'm saying is we understand the dignity of unbelief and that people do in fact disbelieve the gospel. And so when we're dialoguing, we have to give space for that and allow us as Christians to be clear about what is distinctive about the Christian gospel. And what I love about the gospel in this point of ethics is despite the fact that Buddhists are often cited as being full of ethics and compassion, if you go all over the world, any place of suffering in the world, refugee crisis situations, human trafficking, people in drug houses, halfway houses, soup kitchens, who's building homeless shelters, all over the world, you find Christians doing all of those things. And the reason they're in all of those things all over the world, and many of you I'm sure have done those things or are doing those things, nursing homes, helping children without families, on and on and on, is because of the incarnation. God stepped into human history and he took on our pain and suffering. How can we do less? This is the great truth of Christian ethics. Thanks be to God. Thank you very much.
All right. We are very happy and thankful to Dr. Tennent for another excellent presentation. I'm sure there are several questions and we will start working on some of them. Thank you, Tennent, for so enthusiastically, and clearly presenting this to us.
Dr. Kuhn, may I interject just one question of clarification to Dr. Tennent? Was it today or tomorrow that you would address the issue of COVID, mission in light of COVID?
Yeah, I would thought if we had time on this lecture, I'd like to say a few things about COVID. Shall I do it now?
I just wanted to put a note of reminder in case you wanted to do it.
Yeah, why don't I just say a few things while people are sending their question on the Buddhism, and then we can answer a question on both. I'll just say a few brief words. We don't have much time, but I was asked to say whether I think COVID-19 has changed anything or should change anything regarding the work of Christian missions. And of course the answer is yes. But I would start by saying I think the first thing we should say is what should not change in light of COVID. I think we should always say that first. I think it's important to remember the incarnational DNA of Christian missions. In fact, this lecture really reflects that. The whole point of ethics, the nature of us reflecting incarnation is inherently incarnational. And so I believe there is a really important point to be made there, that we don't think the gospel can just be zoomed around the world. We believe that we have to actually embody it in the world through the redeemed community in the world known as the church. So I want to say that up front. But that being said, I do think there are a number of things which can help us beyond kind of the normal things you always hear about how important it is to pivot and how important it is to be creative and all of that. All that, of course, we've learned all of those things, how to use Zoom. But I think in a deeper way, I think there's three things I would point out that I believe COVID should change more permanently our way with missions. The first is the technology that's emerged through COVID around the world has definitely created the possibility, and indeed has, for greater global collaboration. One of the great criticisms of Christian missions is that groups work in isolation from other groups. One of my doctoral students years ago at Gordon Conwell did her PhD thesis on all the groups that had in their mission statement that they were going to reach the world for Christ. And her point was, are they collaborating? The answer was no, they're not. Largely are not. One of the things that's happened today in the last year and a half is that collaboration has improved dramatically. Yesterday I was working with a Jesus film group that is seeking to put the gospel into short 5-minute presentations to Muslim audiences. And they're wanting to go into the Hindu world. And my PhD is actually in the area of Christian response to Hinduism. And so they wanted me to talk to them about some things they could do. Well, I'm here in Kentucky, they're all over the world, and we were to have this conversation that a couple of years ago we wouldn't even thought to have had it. So that's a big plus. Two, I do think, secondly, we've seen a dramatic increase in the availability of the internet. And I mean that particularly the internet, not the computers. Computers are ubiquitous in much of the world, but the internet has not always been. And the internet has increased dramatically over the last year and a half. And this does create all kinds of opportunities for podcasts, videos, blogs, and this lecture today is a great example of that. People from Kenya, from Turkey, all over the world present for this video, which 2 years ago would not have happened, is itself the illustration of my point. And thirdly, I really believe that one of the things that should really help us in the post-COVID world is to understand the importance of moving a greater discipleship and catechesis. As we've spent more time talking to each other during the COVID-19 challenge, we realize so many churches are not suffering from lack of evangelism, but lack of discipleship. How can we help churches to grow, and how can materials be made in their language? Well, the technology can allow us to put much more things in more languages of the world. We still do not have sufficient materials for discipleship in many of the languages of the world. If you take just Hindi, Chinese, and Arabic alone, those three dramatically change what we can do if we had more materials in those languages. Those are just a few thoughts, and I think that that might help stimulate a few questions as well. So I just pause there. I can follow up on any of those, or obviously the questions from the Buddhist lecture.
All right. Thank you again for your considerations on COVID. Yes, indeed, you are spot on some of the challenges and advantages, that it brought about in the world. All right, one question here from William Wells. How does Buddhists, or nationalists blend with its own pursuit of nirvana? It seems that this cannot blend or should not blend based on the textbook understanding of Buddhism.
Yes, well, Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism, at least the great vehicle Buddhism, has multiple branches, and traditionally they're focused on branches like meditative Buddhism, or what's called invocational Buddhism, where you call upon the name of one of these bodhisattvas to be enlightened. And so Pure Land Buddhism is a part of that. So the traditional Buddhist forms that go back centuries did not include the modern day nationalistic strands that the question raised. So today movements like Nichiren, these type of movements, which are nationalistic, is a new development within Buddhism. The question is it a denial of Buddhism? And that's a great question. There are many Buddhists who believe that it is, that this is an embrace of an identity and an orientation that is really denial of the Buddhist vision. Especially monastic Buddhists would argue for that. But others believe, and back to this whole thing of dichotomizing, that once you get to a certain point where you lose a transcendence, they would say you can fight for your nation while you've lost the desire, that unhealthy desire to promote it. And they get to this place where they believe these two can meet together. It's called non-desire desire. And so in that case, there's a little foothold maybe that would allow for it. But your question was correct. This is a matter, even among the Buddhist world, they don't always accept this as being a legitimate expression of Buddhism, because it is more of a modern development.
All right. Another question: how is free will viewed in Buddhism? Can it help in the conversation towards Christianity?
Did you say free will?
Yes.
Yeah, free will. Well, again, in Buddhism, the exercise of will implies a self who is acting, and they don't believe in a self. They believe in the incrustation of the 5 karmic constituents. So you talk about free will, anything like that, any kind of volitional activity, like in the Christian categories of monergism and synergism, what God does, what we do. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in self. Buddhism is non-theistic, and they don't believe in the true self. And therefore, those categories are not helpful in the Buddhist dialogue because they don't accept the categories themselves.
All right. A question from Robert Johnson. Are you acquainted with the theology of Lean A. de Silva? I think he was a Methodist minister who worked.
Yeah.
Can you share something as well about it?
I don't know what his theology is about Buddhism. That's I don't know what he says about that. I know who he is, but I don't know. Has he written books on Buddhism that he wants to particularly ask about?
We have, a dissertation was done here at Andrews University in the 80s about the theology of Lean de Silva, a Methodist minister who I believe worked in Sri Lanka and was from that place. All right, let's move here to another question. How much of the intellectual textbook Buddhism actually translates into the folk Buddhism in the village or urban centers? Are only key points present in their worldview? And what are the differences, intellectual, academic Buddhism versus a village Buddhism?
Yeah, it's a great point. What's basically happened, and we're sticking to the Mahayana, which is the folk Buddhism I think you're talking about. The Mahayana Buddhism that's present in much of the world, because they believe in this invocational Buddhism. That's like the predominant version, like in China, for example. They create what they would call provisional heavens. So, in the wheel of samsara, which we haven't looked at in more detail, but the 12 causal links, they also divide it. It's another way of looking at it in what is like a place called heaven and hell and earth and all of that. So what happens is someone, like a typical peasant person, who believes that they recite the name of Amitabha Buddha, this is the Buddha, enlightened Buddha, Bodhisattva, that they will be able to go to and join him in the Pure Land. So in a very kind of practical sense, that Buddhist believes if they will recite the name of this Buddha, do various things, when they die, they will join him in this heavenly place called the Pure Land. All right. Well, in many ways, that sounds like kind of what we would say. You love Jesus Christ, you die, you go to heaven, or something like that. So on a functional level, it can appear very similarly. The problem is that the heaven and hell in the Buddhist scheme is inside the wheel of samsara. That's to say, it has no ontological existence outside of it, and therefore there is no reality to it ultimately. That's a big problem. But you're right, from a kind of functional point of view, many popular Buddhists don't realize that, or don't fully realize it or understand it. And from their point of view, they're just going to die and join their ancestors or join their in the happy land or pure land. The other point I would say real quick briefly is that folk Buddhism also, like in Tibet, other places, has merged with other religions as well. and other folk practices. And when you get into some of those experiences, you might say all bets are off. Just like cultural Christianity can be like really way off the map in terms of historic beliefs. You also have that problem all over the world with every religion. So we're looking today at kind of what Buddhists believe in the proper sense of the word. But that reality is there, where people don't fully understand always the reality of what the religion teaches.
All right, let us go with some blend of both presentations, some questions that will take them into account. For example, given the Buddhist and Hinduist worldview, what are some of your recommendations in regards to ministering to health and healing needs of these groups based on their context as well, and the plan of God? And how are those, any of those would be bridges to introducing Christ, based on also the ministry, the healing ministry of Christ?
Right, and the answer to that question, Dr. Kuhn, and those who ask it, is that the practical ministries have a benefit both practically and kind of culturally and legally in a place like India, in many parts of the world. In India, you simply cannot go there as a missionary to preach the gospel, plant churches. It's just not possible. They don't give visas for that kind of work. So all the church groups that are involved in effective ministry in India must have ministries they're involved in that the country regards as profitable and helpful. This is even true in parts of East Africa where you have strong Muslim majorities where they won't always be acceptable to have Christian missionaries. My daughter is a missionary in Tanzania for 11 years in a very remote people group in Tanzania. And Tanzania has traditionally been very open to Christian missionaries, but today it's really changing dramatically. Well, the point being is that if you have an orphanage or if you have a ministry that rescues women from human trafficking, any kind of, or obviously clinics and medical facilities, which you are well known for, would be tremendously helpful. Where we work in North India, we have Christian hospitals that have transformed the area, and it gives you opportunity to enter into ministry. The karmic world doesn't give space for compassion for people that are blind or they are deaf, for example, because they believe you got that because you deserved it. And so we have ministry to the blind and to the deaf. And so I would say that these ministries are very helpful, not only to give you a good platform to be present in a country with a visa, but actually it does build a bridge to the gospel, and it's very effective. We found in India, we do a lot of work with educational schools. We started 12 elementary type schools, and especially in areas that are really resistant to the gospel, because they won't let us plant churches, but they will let us plant schools. And those schools are learning Christian songs, they're learning the gospel, and someday those young people will be we call them panchayats, it's like the mayors or the leaders of those villages, and they will bring us in there to plant churches. So it's a multi-generational strategy, and that to me is very helpful. So I do think that these kind of ministries are very important expressions of the gospel, because it's the new creation breaking in. And that's what we want to do. And we don't want to segment it to think that the gospel is just about dying and going to heaven.
Excellent, yeah. And, in time to today's COVID emergency, those ministries are much, much needed. Thank you. Another question from one of our PhD in mission students, Temesgen Basha from Ethiopia. He lives and is in Ethiopia right now. You have helped me understand that we ask completely different questions with Buddhists and also Hindus, but how responsive are they to the message of Christianity, even after listening to their questions and sharing in a way that could be understood?
Yes, and I mentioned in the first lecture on that similar question that unlike the perception, which is that the Hindu world is very close to the gospel, we've not found that to be particularly true. We found a lot of receptivity to the gospel We have statistical data to demonstrate this. That's found in the book, The World Christian Trends, edited by Todd Johnson. But bottom line is, I do believe that there is responses to the gospel. We made the mistake of confusing unreached with unevangelized. And we have to realize those are two separate things. Just because someone hasn't heard the gospel doesn't mean they're automatically resistant to the gospel. And so we need to make sure people have access to the gospel. And there are people groups in India that are resistant. And I think in India, and even in the Buddhist world, the higher you go up in the caste system, people are more resistant. Or they go down into people that have been outcast and disenfranchised, they're obviously more open. So most of our churches are among disenfranchised people. That's true. But I would not say they're particularly resistant to the gospel like you would find in Western Europe today, which is much more challenging. Now, Ethiopia is, of course, just say it, one of the most strategic countries in the world. Not only, mainly because Ethiopia is the great bridge, from Africa up into North Africa and Muslim peoples. So I think the high Christian presence of Ethiopians in a so close proximity to Muslims is extremely strategic. And of course, there's a great Christian tradition there. And so I trust and pray that God will help you to have ministries, because the Islamic world, especially in North Africa, is in fact very resistant. It's another lecture tomorrow, but you're right, it's very challenging. But that wouldn't be comparably true among Hindus or Buddhists compared to what you might experience in your part of the world. By the way, we love that injera bread that the Ethiopians make. It's the best bread in the world.
Yes, indeed. All right, another question that, yes, it will branch out for these various major religions, but it's more specific to Hindus. For a Hindu, there is no problem in accepting Jesus as another God, or, just incorporating Jesus. But how do we really present the uniqueness, this supremacy of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely. It is, in fact, the most important question. That is the controlling question in most of our Hindu work, because of all the questions and problems we encounter, this is the big one. And so we spend a lot of time, of course, explaining. I mentioned last lecture on the thing about the all trains don't lead to a madras. In the same way, all roads don't lead to God. But it's a big challenge. We have to explain it. To be completely honest with you, most of our recipients into churches in India came through some kind of dramatic encounter with the gospel where they were healed or delivered in some kind of way. And then they realized that the God of the faith was a living God, because the Hindu gods, they never healed them or helped them anyway. So praying for the sick is a huge part of getting a door open for someone to consider that actually Jesus Christ is alive, and therefore he alone has risen from the dead. And that's not true for all of our churches, but it's true for many of them. So I do think that you have to have a full orb gospel that believes that God comes in and can dramatically intervene in people's lives today, because that is the evidence that's so powerful for a Hindu.
All right, maybe a trivial question here of curiosity. What percentage do you think, if you perhaps of converts to Christianity in India are from the Dalits as opposed to the mainstream Hindus?
Well, Dalits are the mainstream Hindus in the sense that the majority of Indians in general are in the category of Shudra and Dalit category. It's 52% of Indians. The high caste Brahmins are only about 8% of Indians anyway, so it's a much smaller group. But that being said, the deeper point, I guess, is that our churches are probably, I'm just guessing here, about 85% low caste or outcast peoples, Dalit peoples, 85%. Now, we do have ministry to high caste people, but it's very, very small. and it requires different kinds of work. If you take some examples in history, in Indian history, like Nehemiah Gore, I'm interested in his work, or Brahmabandha Upadhyaya, these are two very famous people that focused on reaching high caste people with the gospel, and it requires a very different kind of approach and work than the general kind of work with most of the main Indians. So, but the typical churches are people that are in that category, actually, and what we work with at least.
All right, I will entertain one more comment and question here, and then we will try to close. Thank you for your helpful overview of Buddhism. You commented on the temporal role of Buddhist ethics due to its footing in the doctrine of anatta, no self. In your understanding, doesn't the Buddhist teaching of cetana, volition, and its impact on the quality of karma substantiate that ethics are robust in Buddhism? In other words, although the dignity of human beings is impacted by their doctrine of anatta, doesn't their doctrine of cetana and karma offset this?
It does somewhat. I do believe that you're right, because they are all throughout Asia, there are karmic rules where if you do certain compassionate acts, it improves or helps your karma. So I hope the listener doesn't believe that we're saying that Buddhists do not engage in ethical acts, because they do, and many of it is exactly along the lines you experience, which is to say, you can improve your karmic position by performing good acts. But my concern about that is to say, my lecture is about saying that is a functional thing. That's a functional kind of activity. That is not a structural basis for ethical action in the world. This is somebody trying to say none can be saved unless we're all saved. And so I think my points still stand. But absolutely, Buddhism does dramatically emphasize ethics, including the volitional work of ethics, as a way of helping improve your karma. It's actually much deeper in Buddhism than Hinduism, because karmic activity, the doctrine of karma, different kinds of karma are emphasized differently within Hindus and Buddhists. They both believe in karma, but there's different kinds of karma, and the Buddhists and Hindus have different ways they emphasize it in their teaching.
Oh, excellent. Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Tennent. The time has come for us to close today's meeting. So I want to remind some things about tomorrow. Tomorrow's session will start at the same time as today. For here in the east of the US, we start at 10 a.m. and we will start at that time in any place you are in the world. The titles of tomorrow's presentation will be Christianity and the Challenge of Islam, the Trinity in Christianity and Islam. That is the first presentation of tomorrow. The second will be the Risen Lord and the worldview, the worldwide mission of the church. Again, the Risen Lord and the worldwide mission of the church. So may God bless you. May God bless your family, your studies. Many of you are students here in the seminary, and you are students in other seminaries around the world, and you are members and workers for the church. So may God bless you. May God bless you, Dr. Tennent, and see you tomorrow at the same time.
Thank you.